During these times, it's really important that we look to models of leadership. This model of Sankofa of looking backwards in order to move forward. So in that spirit, on behalf of Dr. Adams and Dr. Amos Johnson, we in the Andrew Young Center think it's so important to look at these models that have been so effective in the past to help us move forward to the future. So with that said, I want to welcome the 2024-2025 Andrew Young Center Scholar-in-Residence, Dr. Walter Earl Fluker.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Testing, is it on? Can you hear me? This is my body, which is broken for you. I'm here sharing all of the good things that Morehouse can offer. But I'm most excited to be here today with you. Please pardon me if I do a lot of reading. It's not because of you, it's only because I'm old. You can tell how old I was by all of that stuff, right? Well, look at you, man. What's up? What's up? Good. And I forget things. Like yesterday at the gym, I was working out, and I realized, I always put my athletic cream, on my feet after I work out and come out of the shower. How many guys here practice that? Good hygiene. It's probably a good idea. Learn it now before it happens to you. Well, anyway, I realized after I had finished that I'd put toothpaste on my feet. It's stuff like that that happens to me nowadays. So kind of bear with me. You okay? You sure? Good, okay, good. Thank you very much, Professor Young, for those kind and generous words. The most important thing you said today is that I'm married to Dr. Sharon Watson Fluker. I'd love for you guys to meet the most special person in my life, Spelman class of what? Okay. But happy to be here. And to President David Thomas in his absence, to Dr. Jan Adams in her absence, and to the entire team at the Andrew Young Center, especially Marissa, is it Baham? Did I get it right? Baham. Like mayhem. Thank you for your support. And to all of you who are gathered here, I'm not going to bore you, honestly, but I do need to say a few things as we get started. This very place, Sale Hall, was the first office for the Howard Thurman Papers Project when I moved from Rochester, New York. Right there where the meditation room is where we were involved in the work of collecting over 58,000 documents on this great Morehouse alum and selecting from that 58,000 documents, 7,000 for publication in 5 volumes. So the universe of text is broad and long. I also want to say that this return to the Andrew Young Center has been a wonderful liminal experience. It's like a return to memory, and I'm very grateful. I've been here since the fall. I taught a class in the fall, and I'm honored to share with you today a portion of a manuscript which I've been able to complete during my term as Scholar-in-Residence. The manuscript is tentatively entitled Wake Up Running, Theoethical Reflections on Spirituality, Ethics, and Leadership. This lecture is entitled Keep Awake, Howard Thurman on the Run. Now, I can tell you that you probably will fall asleep during this lecture, And I always extend this very large invitation to anyone who is really sleepy and tired to just stand up, wake up, even if you have to scream in order, honestly, if you are ever tempted to fall asleep, or if you could take earplugs out for a minute, you might hear me speak. I'm not going to be demanding and say take all earplugs out, but you might want to take earplugs. If you're seated next to somebody and they have on earplugs or an earphone, whisper to them that you might want to take those out, because I'm giving everybody an invitation. So is anybody near you with earplugs on? They won't beat you up if you tell them. Just whisper in their ear, say, man, you might want to take your earplugs out, because Dr. Fluker is getting ready to say something very, very great and generous. Nobody is going to take me up on that. You see the guy right there with the white on drinking? Ask him to take his earphones off. I know that's hard on him. Can you take your earphones off while I'm talking? I'm very old, and I don't use earphones even myself. How about the guy there, the really good-looking guy in back of you with the red sweatshirt on, the big Morehouse sweatshirt? Yeah, right there. Just tell him, say, man, you know, you might want to. Good, good, good. Thank you very much. Let's get started. Wake up running. I've spent most of my life literally and metaphorically running. From my parents' escape from the big farmhouse of Mr. Johann in Vaden, Mississippi, to my earliest days on the south side of Chicago, running from gun-toting street gangs who needed to prove their manhood, from the ubiquitous presence of police, from white boy terrorists, and from powerful clandestine puppeteers who hide behind the curtains of social fiction and set up, manipulate, and perpetuate the dramas that hold us all in bondage to lies, trickery, and post-colonial nightmares. I've been on the run. I would add that the compulsion to run is not necessarily a deficiency in my character, nor is it an attribute that always suggests fear, dread, and terror. Sometimes it is an intuitive drive to explore new possibilities beyond what is given. Thus, a clear, almost clairvoyant sensibility drives me to the task of returning to running. Mr. Livingston, not only as an historical and literary trope, but as a theological and ethical call to a new generation of leaders like yourselves who will need to wake up every morning on the run. Like the proverb, the creatures of the African savanna, we must wake up running. The gazelle runs to avoid becoming breakfast for some pride of lions, and the lions run to feed their family. Every creature in the savanna wakes up running because of the precariousness of existence. Now, can you repeat that big word with me? Say, precariousness of existence. Let me hear you. So we must wake up running. We must not run in fear, but in faith towards the other and the good futures that we can only imagine. This is a decidedly spiritual undertaking at the very dangerous and maddening crossings of this moment in democratic life, as an ominous cloud of a revived specter of authoritarianism and chaos covers the land, forecasting an encroaching storm. So you might want to consider this lecture also as a storm warning. Need your attention just for a minute because it's going to bore you if you're not a thinker. One of Thurman's greatest quotes, in fact, at the centennial banquet for Morehouse College, Thurman opened his address with these words. He said, "We died, but you who live must do a harder thing yet than dying is, for you must think, and ghost will drive you on." Bear with me just for a few sources and definitions, and then Thurman. I employ the metaphor of running throughout this lecture as a liberative practice for a new generation of leaders. Well, it won't work that way. Hold on. I got it. I employ this metaphor of running for a new generation of leaders on the run. There are two sources for my thinking regarding running as an appropriate sign for our time. The first source is from Octavia Butler's 1993 novel, The Parable of the Sower. How many of you know that novel? It's a great read, especially with the guy back with the earplugs in his ear. It's a great read, The Parable of the Sower, especially for the guy in the middle about 10 rows down next to you who took yours out. Would you let him know that he might want to take his earplugs out? The first source is from Octavia Butler's 1993 novel, The Parable of the Sower, which tells the story of Lauren Oya Alamina, who is on the run because of the political and social chaos taking place in 2024. Interestingly, the novel was written in 1993, but she places it in 2024. She is a runaway who embodies the role of a bricoleur or a bricoleur, a handy person, a resourceful person who identifies available materials and repurposes them as tools for survival. Her runaway bag, like her ancestors, contains essential items for her journey north. The name Oya is derived from the Yoruba goddess of birth and life, and Lauren Oya, a young black woman, leads a small community of diverse individuals through many crossings of destruction and death to new life and possibilities. They rally around common purposes, what I call a commons, which may or may not continue in the future, but they address the precarious moment at hand. Say precarious again. Second, throughout these lectures, I give another lecture in April on Martin King. I'm playing with and privileging the notion of running, as in running away and running to, which are encapsulated in the language of Runagate, drawing from a brilliant essay entitled Interpreters Enslaving Enslaved Runagates by Morehouse alum Vincent Wimbush, class of 75. According to Wimbush, the term runagate is an alternate of renegade, the Middle Latin renegatus, meaning fugitive or runaway. Wimbush writes, it has come to carry the meaning of a more transgressive act than mere flight. It is maroonage, running away with an attitude and a plan, a taking flight in body, but even more importantly, in terms of consciousness, or an awakening to one's path towards freedom. Both Butler and Wimbush place a premium on running, watching, and writing, presenting them as expressions of a unified activistic consciousness. Thus, I present running as a spiritually liberating practice as we reimagine democratic futures with emerging leaders in this season of contested political and religious spaces. Public and private leaders need to begin with the basic consideration that our projects have always been and will continue to arise from lived experiences, not from the exalted hierarchical dominant master classes whose ideological and cultural narratives of supremacy and fascism portend a shadowy and hazardous future for the least of these. Our interpretive and activistic tasks are contextual and constructive, which means that our visions of democracy must resist not only oppressive, monolithic constructions of deadly religious, political, and cultural discourses, but also corporatism and empire that feed on the fears, prejudices, and ignorance of many of our citizens who have been lulled to sleep by vast and complex systems of technology and communication in the name of America first, and xenophobic beliefs of white supremacist logic and protocol. Are you all with me? For this urgent moment when we are witnessing the forced migration of our brothers and sisters of the diaspora, the dismantling of the separation of powers, of religion and state, and the empowerment of a plutocracy where winners take all, we must insist upon diversity, equity, multiplicity, openness, and dynamism, or in the words of a great, great song of the 60s, we got to wake up running. It was Martin King, your blessed alum, who over 60 years ago spoke to the urgency of now. Now more than ever, I think we need to heed his clarion call to make real the promises of democracy in this nation and beyond. We need to create communities of discourse and practice that acknowledge our real and distinct differences and yet seek ways to adapt and, if possible, run together and embrace our differences for the urgent moment at hand. I think this is possible because of our religious and social constructions of reality, as I suggested, are always contextual. Contextual, young man. Can you say contextual? They're not set in stone forever and ever. They are contextual and constructive. Therefore, be vigilant, flexible, and adaptive as we wake up running. Those are the sources. You ready now for one big definition? Can you stay with me that long? You good, man. I smell your brain. You good. That's good. That's good. I want you to think about democratic space. Democratic space. Throughout both of these lectures, I will employ the term democratic space. Democratic space refers to the ongoing struggle against what is happening right now in our country and around the globe. It's the reconfiguration of space and the reordering of time for subjugated bodies, and creating and cultivating equitable and just environments for those bodies that have been historically unacknowledged and unwelcome. This idea is represented in the political philosopher Jacques Rancière's notion of policing versus politics. So when we get to discussion, I'm going to ask you to remember precarious, I'm going to ask you to remember contextual, and I'm going to ask you to remember policing and politics, the difference between the two as they relate to democratic space. Policing, for Rancière, is not necessarily about law enforcement in the conventional sense, but it refers to the existing system of roles, hierarchies, and distributions of power. It is the way society organizes itself to determine who has authority, who participates in decision making, and who is counted as a legitimate political subject. Do you think for 1 minute Donald Trump and the new administration cares about what kind of authority you have as a subject and as a moral agent? Rancière is trying to help you to understand that policing begins with the rule that governs your body's appearing. Not just your mind, not just your thoughts, but your very body, your black body. Policing refers to the rule that governs the body's appearance. It is the structuring of occupations and the properties of spaces that you occupy. Where these spaces are distributed, they're kind of set up for you, where you sit. That's too deep for one day. Let me just turn this way and look this way for a minute. That is, this whole thing was not necessarily designed with you in mind, but somehow you're here. I'm going to say it again for the record, and then I'm going to rush on. Policing refers to the rule that governs the body's appearing. It is the structuring of occupations and the properties of the spaces where these occupations are distributed. It determines who is in and who is out, who speaks and who is allowed to speak. Policing is different from politics. Politics, on the other hand, is an extremely determined activity that is antagonistic to policing because it is a human activity that turns on equality as its principal or basic presupposition. Politics happens when those who have been excluded from a system challenge it and demand inclusion. It is the emergence of a new subjectivity that disrupts the dominant order. In this sense, democracy concerns a struggle for the redefinition of the distribution of certain shares or spaces among certain groups, whom Rancière calls that part of those who have no part. That of the part of those who have no part. Here the concern is with the people, the demos, those who are not accounted for in the configuration of power, those relegated to animal life with sound, but who cannot speak. For Howard Thurman, it meant to be ignored, to be passed over as of no account and as of no meaning. It meant to be made into a faceless thing, not a man. It is to act with no accounting, to go nameless up and down the streets of other minds where no salutation greets and no sign is given to mark the place one calls one's own. Nonetheless, we know that these bodies do dare to speak, break, shift, and redefine the spaces they have been assigned. And it is precisely because they dare to use speech, logos, reason with value, that they reveal the process of equality, because only a free human can speak. The history of Morehouse College is an excellent representation of this phenomenon of black bodies daring to speak with reason and value and shifting and reconfiguring, creating new spaces. More and more, as we witness the encroaching authoritarian nexus of money and power, oligarchy, and the devastating assaults on the poor and human rights across the globe and in our own nation, the quest for democratic space is urgent and necessary. Now to Thurman. I just want to get my definitions out of the way. Is that okay with you? Want to breathe? I just don't want you to get lost. It's a terrible thing to be lost. James Baldwin said, one day when I was lost, I just don't want to be lost. Howard Thurman woke up running. Born in the throes of poverty, fatherless at the age of 7, raised by his mother and grandmother in the post-Reconstruction realities of Daytona, Florida, his eyes were set on a distant future of freedom and justice. From these humble beginnings, he became one of the leading religious thinkers of the 20th century. He was a mentor to leaders of the civil rights movement and Black consciousness movement, and a mystic who pioneered influential innovations in liturgy, worship, and spirituality in the quest for common ground. His life was an extraordinary marathon, from Jim Crow, Florida at the turn of the 20th century to meeting Mahatma Gandhi, co-founding one of the first interracial, intercultural, and religious and observer and astute interpreter of American democratic dogma. Often caricatured from within and without the African American community as a powerful preacher and detached mystic, until the groundbreaking work of Luther E. Smith at Candler School of Theology in 1981, Thurman had been politely ignored, or at best considered irrelevant to the pressing social issues impacting public life in general and Black life in particular. A large part of his increasing popularity in the academy and beyond is the result of the work of the Howard Thurman Papers Project and the many scholars who assisted in the publication of the 5 that Dr. Young alluded to in her introduction. Thurman's approach to social justice has been labeled by some as unresponsive to the needs of oppressed peoples. But I suggest that this reading of Thurman is misinformed and unjustified. A serious, reflective reading of the Thurman corpus reveals a fundamental concern of the oppressed, the demos, the people. In fact, Thurman had very clear and strong convictions about African Americans and the nature of community. I'm going to run ahead of what I have so you can stay with me. Thurman's corpus is filled with stories about his Black skin. Find that again. Sorry about that. His corpus is filled with stories and reflection that depict his Black body as policed, in the sense that I've spoken, as chattel, as a thing that makes sounds but could not speak and feel. He was keenly aware of the tactics used by enslavers to make him stand in fear. But Thurman was able also to understand the ways in which religion and culture combine to create this portrait of the Black body. The Thurman biographer Peter Eisenstadt, who worked with the Papers Project, chronicles three events in Thurman's train travels during the era of segregation that define his black body as a thing, a that, and a zigaboo. He's riding the train, minding his own business, reading the newspaper, and somebody would say, "Who is that zigaboo?" Or "Who is that thing?" Thurman references this throughout his writings, and the idea of his restricted movement, constantly on the guard against the fear of violence and death. Contemporary police practices by vigilantes and state-sponsored violence against black bodies are continuations of this long-standing rule that governs the black body's appearing, the ordering and reordering of black flesh. Yet for Thurman, his experiences of living as black flesh, living with black skin, living in and out of a black body that spoke and felt were inseparable from his humanity and understanding of freedom, equality, and the social mobility of black bodies, bodies on the run. Thurman's black flesh, therefore, is a site of memory, what historians John Blassingame and Mary Frances Berry called long memory, long lingering memories that invite us to revisit places where we remember, retell, and relive the story of African enslavement and trauma, where we read the trees carved on Africans' backs, the undecipherable markings, breaks, fractures, brandings, punctures, missing parts, the hieroglyphics of discardable, fungible flesh, commodity, cargo that built America and the modern world. It is rememory of slave patrols, black bodies laboring and producing Florida sugarcane, rice, and indigo in plantations in Mississippi cotton fields and Alabama coal mines, and the continuing state-sponsored policing of black bodies for 9 minutes and 29 seconds multiplied by a veritable infinity of not breathing. Thurman's writings are saturated with these memories and counter-memories of his problematized black flesh and the tragic soul life of African Americans. When Thurman was a student at Colgate, Rochester, brilliant student, every school that Thurman went to, including Morehouse, he graduated valedictorian, as he did at Rochester Theological Seminary. And at the end of his time at Rochester Theological Seminary, he met with his professor, George Cross. And George Cross sat Thurman down, and he said to him, "You are a brilliant young Negro man." This is in the 1920s. "And I think that it would be a good thing to give yourself to the timeless issues of the human spirit and not get involved with citizen rights for your people." And Thurman said that he sat there and he pondered what that would mean for him in his black skin. Or how do you ponder the timeless issues of the human spirit in a black body? This basic idea and question, and Thurman's response to it, was the basis of most of his deep thinking, literally about mystical experience. To miss that is to miss Thurman. His work is not about abstract conversation on the blackboard. It's about his lived experience, living in a policed body, considering the timeless issues of the human spirit. I'm almost through. Want to take a breather? You good? I'm almost through. The worst thing in the world, man, is to bore people. For instance, I happen to know that in hell, there's a special place for people who bore one another. And I don't want to go to hell. I just, so kind of let me know if your mind can't catch up with this. In one of Thurman's earliest published sermons, Keep Awake, June 1937, he tells the story of the Indian musk deer on the run. Listen, he says, it is said that in the springtime, the musk becomes terrible in its agony. Stream, body aching with desire. It's springtime. Confident that around the next turning, he will discover the musk, object of his quest. This goes on until at last he falls exhausted with his tiny head resting on his still more tiny hoofs, to discover that the odor of the musk is in his own hide. Nearest to Mathura, if you have not found your own soul, the world is unreal to you. For Thurman, there are two interdependent yet contending forces at work that set us on the run. One is the day-to-day need for self-nourishment, in which he says life feeds on itself. This universal instinctive drive for survival results in the precariousness of existence. Say that again. Say it with precarious. It's such a cool thing, man. If you're on a date or something, just mention precarious. Say, yeah, this is a very precarious moment right now. Just use the word. This universal instinctive drive for survival results in the precariousness of existence, the uncertainty of existence. That is, today you doing well, you're breathing great air. Tomorrow, who knows what might happen between now? That's precarity. But precariousness is true for everything in all creation. At any moment, things can change. I think we're in a very precarious place in our democracy. And if you're not paying attention, guess what? On the other hand, there's something else, Thurman says, within us that desires connection to the source of life in acts of creation, freedom, and transformation. Both this precariousness of existence where life feeds on itself and this desire for connection with the source of life are part of the dynamic principle that he calls the aliveness of life. Life for Thurman is alive. This is a breathing, pulsating universe. I'm alive, he said. He used to say, you're alive, you're alive, you're alive. I think he's alive. But beyond all of that, life itself is alive. That is, I will die, you will die, she will die, but life will keep on lifing. Because life, you got that? Can you grasp that? That life itself. So this dynamic tension between the precariousness of existence and the ways in which we yearn to be more than who we are, to dream dreams bigger than ourselves and the world, are all a part of life itself being alive. Thurman observes this is true even in a house plant. He said, you walk in, why is it that the house plant, and I know the scientists here know a lot about biology and plants, but the plant just seems to turn to the sun on its own accord. He says that he believes this is because life itself is alive. I'm suggesting to us that this precariousness of existence and this push and pull is a kind of a dialectic where we are always at one moment afraid of the next predatory instinct that's going to come for us, and yet at the same time there's something within us that stands on its hind legs and dreams new dreams and imagines new possibilities. As we awaken, and I'm kind of sort of closing, to the contingencies and ambiguities of this third decade of the 21st century, this precarious moment in democratic life, a long list of existential threats, including climate change, war, dismantling government, political violence, state violence, pharmacide, and the fascist masquerades that restrict dissent and free speech have left many of us fearful, anxious, and paralyzed. And one of Howard Thurman's greatest contributions to this present impasse, beyond the dialectic that I've just mentioned, was his treatment of fear in Jesus and the Disinherited. Bear with me for a moment. There he treats fear as one of the persistent hounds of hell that dog the footsteps of the disinherited. What a powerful metaphor. Think about it. Thurman is writing this in the 20th century, started thinking about it in the late 1920s, worked it through and published it in the late 40s, and he's working on this idea of fear. And he says fear is one of the hounds of hell. You got to be careful if you read Thurman that you don't miss what he's saying. Why would he call fear a hound? Because he knew the history of Africans in this country who were runaways and maroons trying to escape, survive, and create new futures. So when he released Jesus and the Disinherited, he wanted to call it the Hounds of Hell, but the publisher wouldn't allow it. The first thing he does with fear, he suggests that fear for the oppressed is a learned behavior. It's habitual. You learn over and over again to be afraid. Always at the mercy of, here's that big word again, of the precariousness of existence. Always aware of the vulnerability of your black body. Think about this. This is in the 20s, 30s. That's segregation. So he does an analysis of segregation. Like a trained doctor, like Dr. Tooks with a scalpel in his hand, he dissects the anatomy of fear, deception, and hate. How many have read Jesus and the Disinherited or just looked at it? You know when you walk in the library or the bookstore, you just look at it and you think you read it? Or how many people have tried to read it? You might want to look at this because he's working on something powerfully relevant, I think, to our time. He said what fear does to the oppressed is to make them despise themselves because it strips them of their dignity. Always afraid, always anxious, always fearful that around the corner the precarity, the vulnerability of existence comes for you. And when you're afraid all the time, he says you learn to become deceptive. So what are you going to do when he comes for you? Are you going to tell him the truth? Oh, no, I ain't going to tell him the truth. I'm not going to tell him where the black boy hides in the swamp. I'm not going to tell him. I'm not going to tell him what I really think of him because I'm afraid. Is everybody with me? Since you can't stay with my lecture, I'm trying to help you. I'm trying to help you. Stay with me. Ask yourself before we leave here today, why is it that I'm always so afraid? And why is it in somehow in my incredible imagination, my ego tells me that I can just run out here and not be afraid. And I discover that there's always something there haunting me, like these hounds. Just hold that for a thought. So, y'all with me? Because I'm moving to another place. If I'm always afraid, and if fear makes me deceitful, if I cannot speak the truth from my own center, out of my own integrity, and I'm locked into fear and deception, I become a lie to myself. This is what Thurman is after. He says in the great story of how many of y'all good Christian people? Y'all know the story of Lucifer? This ain't Thurman, this Fluker here. I'm trying to break Thurman down, though, right? You know the story of Lucifer? You know, he was a really cool dude. He was in the choir in heaven like some of y'all. And then he got in trouble, right? And they kicked him out because of his willfulness, and he falls, and he wakes up where? In hell. He wakes up in hell. And he looks around. John Milton says, I looked around, and there was hell there, and I looked there was hell, and all around. And behold, I've become hell. Thurman is concerned about the care of the soul. If I'm afraid, if I can't speak truth to myself, and I lie to others and to myself, the next step, he says, is to hate myself. Because I really hate you. Because you made me afraid. And he's talking about a larger culture. He's not talking about just an individual white person. Don't go out here and just hate white people. I'm not saying that. But the deep fear, deception, and hatred issues forth in what he calls hell walking on earth. Here are the questions for us as we leave. And these are Thurman's questions. How does the human spirit accommodate itself to desolation? To always be afraid. And he's asking this question on a ship on his way to Nigeria. I just shared with Dr. Livingston. He's passing the coast of Gambia, and he's talking with his ancestors. And he says, oh, my fathers, what was it like? And then he asks himself the question, how does the human spirit accommodate itself to desolation? How did his ancestors? What tools of the Spirit were in their hands with which to cut a path through the wilderness of their despair? What methods, strategies, practices of the Spirit are available to us to cut away this ghostly conundrum of evil, disguised, repeated lies of a fascist masquerade? Last story. He edited a book by a South African writer named Olive Schreiner. Olive Schreiner was an incredibly serious feminist, an ally with Africans. She had a few white problems. All our allies have problems. But Thurman fell in love with her writings, her thoughts. And one of the stories that she tells is an allegory. It's the story of a woman who is on her way to the land of freedom. And she's running toward this land, but she doesn't know where it is. And she meets an old man on the way who is all cloaked over, has a cane. In the allegory, he's Reason. And Reason says to her, "Where are you going?" And she said, "I'm trying to find my way to the land of freedom." And the old man said, "What is that under your cloak?" And it was a small child she was hiding under her cloak in fear. Very dangerous statement, but the old man said, "You're going to have to let that go if you want to get to freedom." I won't stay there. Finally, when she makes her way a little further, she cries out to the old man and she says, "I'm so afraid." He said, "Afraid of what?" "See over there, this river that you must cross in order to get over to the land of freedom?" And she said again, "I'm afraid, I'm so afraid." And he says to her, and this is my last word to you, men of Morehouse. He said, "Make a track to the water's edge." And she says, "Well, how will I get over this great river?" And he says, "You see the locusts, how one comes and then another?" She said, "But they die trying to cross the river." He says, "But over time, one comes, another comes, and yet another, and another, and another." And she said, "Yes, they build a bridge." He says, "A bridge to the land of freedom." She said, "How shall this be?" And he tells her, he says, "Listen." And she hears the pitter-patter of feet behind her. Thousands upon thousands of feet are behind her. And he says again to her, "Make a track to the water's edge." And the allegory closes. She leaves everything and she steps into the river. Over your bodies, I'm so serious about bodies, black bodies. Over your bodies, if you dare to be courageous, if you dare to struggle for democratic space, my friends, you're not alone. Because just as Thurman and so many others in your tradition stood at that river and were alone and afraid, they could hear the pitter-patter of feet coming behind them. When you leave here and represent Morehouse, remember that you're part of a tradition of those like Thurman who made a track to the water's edge. Thank you very much.